Welcome back to another episode of The Fertile Dark. I'm your host, Dan. And this week we've got another solo episode. I recently had an opportunity to go to a high school graduation for some students that I had taught. During the ceremony, several students were asked to speak. And I was really struck by something that one of them said at the very outset of the speech that they gave. They started out by apologizing for not being perfect in the delivery and preparation of their speech. They went on to give a very excellent message for all of the graduates that was incredibly inspiring and showcased a significant amount of really beautiful vulnerability. One that I think even the adults and younger students who were present took a lot away from. But I found myself struck by the need to apologize for not being perfect, particularly because I feel like so many of us struggle with this idea that being perfect or faultless or flawless is somehow the norm, the expectation, and that to show up as anything less than that is to say that we are somehow not enough. And so what I wanted to do was spend some time exploring this problem of perfectionism and see if we can uncover a little bit of what that does to us when we are adherents to its influence, as well as ways that we can overcome it together. So I love the way that Brené Brown talks about perfectionism, as well as some of the ways that we can see perfectionism explored through a Jungian lens. When we consider perfectionism through the psychological lens, through whether that's Jungian or otherwise, we see that it acts as a persona that we are attempting to inhabit or wear as a way to prevent us from experiencing deep feelings of shame, judgment, and inadequacy, which really makes a lot of sense. It's perfectionism. It's this quest to make sure that our relationships are secure. It's a way of evaluating ourselves consistently, as well as consistently scanning the environment around us for any indications that we are somehow showing up in a way that will lead to us being rejected or seen as somehow less than. One of the real roots of perfectionism is some kind of externally enforced standard, typically a standard that is actually unachievable, that we are attempting to live up to as a way to protect ourselves. Contrast that with a standard that is internally driven, an internal striving for wholeness, completeness, or performance in some way that is satisfying and empowering from an internal place. When we make the shift from perfectionism to a wholeness-oriented or completeness-oriented perspective, what we're able to do is really unshackle ourselves from unrealistic expectations that are driven from a place of protecting us from shame, blame, judgment, and fear. And this is something that I definitely have struggled with. I was recently in a therapy session for myself where I was working with these two different parts. One that works to keep me from feeling much, to be able to like numb and stay very even keeled so that way I'm not distracted by my feelings or I'm not too much or overwhelming for people. But the other side of the coin was this part of me that feels like I have to be excellent at everything. And the standard of excellence that this part holds is really a flawlessness. I have to be above reproach. I have to always exceed expectations. Whatever the minimum standard is, I always have to go beyond that. The minimum is never enough. And so many times we find this within ourselves. It's a socially sanctioned mentality, right? Never strive for the bare minimum. Always strive for 100%. Anything less than 100% just isn't good enough. We all fall into this trap. And when I think about it from my own perspective, I think about the way that as a kid, I had multiple experiences of receiving this message that I wasn't good enough, that I would never amount to anything, that I'd never actually be successful. I remember that in really multiple contexts. One was, as a kid, my relationship with my parents was pretty tumultuous, where I felt like, particularly with my mom, no matter what I said, was never going to be enough. She was always going to be smarter, more accomplished, wiser, more experienced. Like I could never be enough as I was. Take that then into high school. I remember my wrestling coach consistently humiliating me in front of the team, where, I missed a move in a match, and so now I have to practice it on every member of the wrestling team in front of the entire team until I can get it right. And the whole time I'm going to be met with derision and disappointment, just never being enough. And I even remember my coach to my face telling me I was never going to amount to anything, which I took really personally. Like this was someone that I was constantly trying to impress. I was constantly trying to show him I was good enough. I was a good enough wrestler. I was a good enough team member. And then I remember getting the message, even from my teachers and my school counselor, that I really didn't have much prospects after school. Feeling like I was being told there just really weren't any options for me. My parents really weren't supportive of that idea either. And so for me, the only option that I felt like I had was to enlist and go into the military, which the military really loves to reinforce this mentality of perfectionism. They set the bar at about 70% for most of your conventional things. And if you're at the 70%, which is meeting the standard, you're generally ridiculed and told that you're barely making it and you need to do better and you need remedial training, you need remedial academic support, whatever it is. And then they reward those who strive to far exceed the standard. I can even remember one instance where I was in a training. It was the qualification training for my last job that I had. And the first portion of the training was very academically focused, lots of classroom things. And at the end of every module, we would take a test. And I remember being sat down by one of the instructors after the final academic test, and him being very confused and disappointed because up until that point, my average had been 100%, but I missed one question on the final written test. And my instructor was disappointed that I wasn't able to get that last one right. And he was confused why I didn't do better. And there's so many other examples of this, but I really used the military as a way to feed into that perfectionistic need. And I think all of us have, we all have these ways that we do the same thing. We subscribe to this mentality that we never are enough as we are. We always have to be better. And the only standard that we have is to be flawless, is to be quote unquote perfect. And anything less than that is something that we need to apologize for, as if the human experience is an invalid one. And it really is a huge weight to try and carry it around. This effort, this trying to protect ourselves from shame and blame and judgment and rejection for being human, for being flawed in some way. I love the way that Brené Brown talks about it. She refers to it as the 20-ton shield that we carry around. And it really does feel like that. You know, there's so many ways that this crops up in our lives. It can be in adhering to the status quo, right? One great example that I came across this last week as I was researching, studying, preparing, was this idea of maxing that has become apparently quite popular on TikTok and other places, where there is this standard of behavior, a standard of physical appearance that is the quote unquote ideal. And I saw videos of people taking hammers to their faces. I See people being overly meticulous about what their food and sleep looks like. It can really take us into some unhealthy places when we subscribe to this idea that we have to be flawless, perfect. It really lacks compassion, which is the opposite of what we want to be doing. So when we look at overcoming this issue, which I think is really quite common for all of us in some way, shape, or form, there is some way that we lack compassion for ourselves, that we maybe hold ourselves to a different standard than we would hold other people to. One of the things that we can do is we can go internally into that unintegrated place of shadow, into the unconscious, and we can find the parts of us that are using this constant mode of scanning and assessing and find out why it's really there. What is it that's motivating that part of us? For example, when I look within myself and I find that place, that part of me that says, it's not enough for me to simply meet a standard. I always have to hold myself to a perfect standard. I'm not allowed to make mistakes. For me, what I find inside is I find a series of memories where when I made a mistake, I was punished physically. And I don't mean like I was spanked or I was put into timeout. I mean, there was some very difficult physical ramifications of abuse that happened. And so for me, the only way to be physically safe was to always be scanning the environment, to always be monitoring people's emotional level, always be monitoring how tired people were, how regulated people were, always be assessing, are there needs that are present that aren't being met yet, and constantly being on guard and in that scanning place so that I could be able to preemptively meet those needs, check those boxes, meet that standard. Sometimes that meant that I really had to leave the house and not be present. But it meant that I was always scanning even later on in work and in school and always working to be at a level that was unsustainable, which for me, I've had moments where I've really struggled. I remember being in second year Arabic class, and the standard was to get, I want to say, a B minus at a B plus, and it wasn't good enough, so I dropped out of school and changed my major when I came back. Because for me, getting a B plus when I needed a B minus, it just was cutting it too close. So that's one of the places we want to go. So we want to go and we want to find the place within that is really motivating that behavior pattern. What is it that tells us that we are not allowed to have flaws, that we're not allowed to be on a growth journey? The second thing that we want to do is shift our mindset from I'm trying to meet an external standard to now I'm trying to find a place of inner completeness, inner wholeness. So this is where we take the lens of trailheads or growth edges. So we can balance out our experiences with celebrating wins and identifying trailheads and growth edges. And here's what I mean by that. So as an example, I recently was trained in a therapeutic technique. And one of the first times I got to use it, I felt like something came up that I knew how to deal with, but that I wasn't quite attuned enough in the moment to be able to recognize earlier on. And so we had to pause and come back the next time. Afterwards, I was able to do a little assessment and say, okay, it didn't go the way I wanted to. However, what I did do was actually really, really good. And here are the ways that I saw this go well. I noticed that here I missed something. Here's my growth edge. What was it about this experience that led me to miss the cue that something needed to be addressed in a different way earlier on? So this is my growth edge. And then now I get to ask the question, what's the trailhead? Why did I miss it? Oh, I was too focused on the steps and not focused enough on what was happening right in front of me. Great. Go into the next time I use this technique. I fixed the thing that I wanted to work on last time. I had gone down this trailhead. I had found this piece that I needed to work on. I worked on it and it went significantly better. I was able to have what seemed like 100% improvement on the task, meaning that I caught it right away. I made the shift right away. We were able to get into it. Okay. Where was the growth edge? The growth edge was around timing. I didn't give myself enough time. Well, why didn't I give myself enough time? And then so I found the growth edge of time management, and now the trailhead is, why did I not give myself enough time? Well, I put in too much fluff. I was trying to be too personal. Oh, I spent too much time, like I didn't give myself enough time total because I felt a little nervous. Oh, that's interesting. Why do I feel nervous here? And now all of a sudden the growth can begin to happen. I can celebrate the win. I can identify my growth edge, and then I can start to ask the question why and find the trailhead. And this can happen with really anything that we're working on. It doesn't have to be like a work specific thing. It can be a personal thing. Okay, maybe I'm really wanting to work on my physical health, my physical well-being. All right, what are my wins? Okay, well, maybe I've got a really good sleep schedule. Maybe I'm doing a really good job of getting downtime. Maybe I'm struggling with exercise or I'm struggling with nutrition. Meaning that I want it to be different. I want it to be more focused on supporting my authentic expression, supporting my well-being. Okay, great. Where is my growth edge? Oh, well, maybe my growth edge here is that I'm really tired in the morning and so my workouts aren't happening. Well, now, okay, what's the trailhead? Okay, well, why am I so tired? Well, maybe I'm going to bed too late, or I'm not sleeping well enough, or maybe the tiredness is I'm actually too stressed from the stress that I'm carrying during the week and I'm holding on to too much, and I need a different kind of self-care to release that stress and tension so that I have energy in the reserves to be able to exercise in the morning when I want to. But you get the idea here, hopefully. One of the ways that we can separate ourselves from perfectionism is to change our paradigm. We can tell ourselves, I don't have to apologize for being human because I'm not trying to meet some arbitrary external standard that is actually unachievable. Instead, I'm trying to work on completeness and wholeness, which comes from celebrating my wins, identifying my growth edges, and following trailheads. Those trailheads will often lead us to the inside of ourselves, where we find the parts of us that feel the need to show up in a way that is preventing us from experiencing shame, blame, judgment, rejection in some way. Something else that we can do that helps us with perfectionism is we can actually make social contracts with people close to us. For example, there's somebody that I know who they always apologize for everything. They apologize for sneezing. They apologize for crying. They apologize for really everything. And we made an agreement that in order to help, like the thing that would be helpful for them is for me to remind them, you don't need to apologize for that. So now every time they apologize, at least for the first little bit, I would remind them, hey, you don't need to apologize for that. There's nothing to apologize for there. It's really okay. You don't need to apologize. And now they are now practicing that message as well, where they will apologize. They'll make eye contact with me, and then they'll say, I don't need to apologize. And it's become this almost mantra for them, which here we have this growth edge where we can ask for some social support, right? I don't need to apologize. I am enough as I am. There's nothing I've done wrong that merits an apology. We can also ask ourselves if we're maybe a habitual apologizer. We can also ask ourselves, why do I feel the need to apologize so much? What message am I holding that is causing me to need to apologize? This is a really important thing we can do is we can bring somebody in and we can say, hey, like I'm really trying to practice more kindness towards myself. Can you help me with that? And what we find then is now we have an alliance that we build where we can help support each other in saying, yeah, no, like there's not a need for that. Like who you are is enough. You don't need to apologize here. And we can destigmatize imperfection. It's definitely a thing that can be really challenging to do, especially if we have a lot of internal structure that supports that type of thought process. Like when we're really struggling with it and we find ourselves constantly in this loop. We can also start to evaluate the people we have in our lives. We can evaluate who are the people in my relationships that I currently have that are reinforcing this stigma of perfectionism. And at that point, we can have conversations, right, where we can express to them, hey, listen, when you respond to me this way, when you talk to me this way, when you treat me this way, when you react this way, it makes me feel like I am unable to make mistakes. It makes me feel like I have to be perfect all the time and that there's no room for imperfection. Often when we have those conversations, if we're in a relationship with a person who's really aligned, that kind of conversation will set alarm bells off for them. People who, the kind of people we would want to have in our life, when we say to them, hey, listen, this thing, like this reaction that you have, like brings this experience up in me. People who really care about us and who we want to have in our life, they are going to be the kinds of people who say, oh, wow, I would never want that to happen. I would never want you to feel that way. I want to change that perception. And then we can work together collaboratively. Having the conversation also lets us be able to get some insight if there are people in our lives who maybe they're going to tell us something about themselves that lets us know that maybe we don't want them in our lives after all. Maybe they really are trying to reinforce that mentality. Maybe they really do want us to feel like we have to be completely flawless, that there's no room for imperfection within us. And those kinds of people, like when they tell us that about themselves, that's a great indicator that something in that relationship needs to change. Not necessarily that I can tell you what to do about it, just that it sounds like there needs to be a change. One of the stories that comes to mind when I think about the experience of perfection, I mean, there are several that come to mind. One of the myths that I often think of is that of Narcissus. And Narcissus is a Greek myth about a young man who's said to have the perfect attractiveness. And when he was born, the priest, the oracle, told his mother, never let him stare into a mirrored surface or it'll destroy him. And so Narcissus grew up in this way of never being able to look into mirrored surfaces until one day he was hunting in the woods and came across this still pond where he caught a reflection of his own image. And by so doing, he became so enamored with the reflection of his image that he was unable to look away and found himself constantly absorbed with his reflected image for the rest of his life. One of the challenges that he ran into here, or that is part of the story, is that one of the nature spirits named Echo fell in love with Narcissus, but she had been cursed for a different experience where she was only able to echo back what she heard from another person. And Echo fell deeply in love with Narcissus. And then we have this really strange experience where Narcissus is unable to truly see and hear Echo and the pain that she's in trying to express her love. All he instead hears is the echo back of his own thoughts and feelings as he is enamored with the image of perfection, which we often can see this struggle play out where we become so fixated on becoming flawless that we actually become overly identified with self-assessment. And we lose our capacity for kindness, for compassion. We often then begin to idolize others for their perceived perfection. We project things onto them, which then when we meet these people in a way where we see their imperfection, then it shatters our view of them. It's where we get this idea of never meet your heroes, is that we're actually projecting onto them this desire for some intrinsic goodness that we don't believe that we have. The beautiful thing about this type of projection is that often the people we look up to most are the people who reflect back to us things that are the best about ourselves. On the flip side of this, when we are maybe overly concerned or fixated on the imperfection of others, where we become really dysregulated by it, that is often a reflection back to us of a piece of ourselves that is needing to be integrated. Another way to phrase this is that we become so fixated on the imperfection of others because we can't stand the idea of the imperfection within ourselves. And so by being able to release ourselves from this need for flawlessness, what we end up doing is we end up creating a much deeper capacity for kindness, for compassion, for connection to ourselves and to each other, because we are able to release this over-identification with this unobtainable standard that we adhere to. One of the things that I find that often feeds into this narrative of perfectionism is actually disconnecting ourselves from lessons of the past. And what I mean by this is that we look at our experience, our N of one, a generalized expression of truth. So, and this comes out in really interesting ways. We'll say, well, this is how I grew up, and I'm fine. Look at where I'm at. So obviously it's okay. We also do another version of this where we say, well, I'm doing better than so-and-so, right? And so that must be enough. But typically we do the first, is we say, oh, well, it was enough for me, therefore it must be enough for you too. And what we end up doing here is we end up actually cutting ourselves off from the past. We forget the stories of the past and we disconnect our experience from the greater whole. We don't allow ourselves permission to see that there are other opportunities out there. So for example, when we start to compare ourselves to other people, when we rob ourselves of our capacity for humanity through this need for comparison, we are typically following trends that are existing in the moment in a fixed location in time and space. So if I live one of the towns that's close by is, Gilbert, Arizona. And let's say that I live in Gilbert, Arizona, and there's a lot of trends that are currently happening around fashion, around decor, around what vehicle I drive, around what my hair looks like, or whatever it is, my level of fitness. There's certain brands that are in vogue, whatever it is, doesn't matter. When I begin to set those as my standard and then compare myself to that as my standard, anytime I deviate from it, I say, oh my gosh, I'm sorry that I'm not perfect because this is the standard. What we're not giving ourselves an opportunity for is to take a wider view, because this is a localized standard. This actually doesn't speak to a more broader tale of the human experience. We forget where we've come from. We forget the stories that brought us to who we are, where we are. All we have is the present moment and the tangible standard that we use. And because of this fear of rejection, rather than judging the standard, we judge ourselves. So something else that we can do as a way to challenge this experience of perfectionism is to connect more with story, particularly with myth. Myth holds a lot of information for us. I love the way that Michael Meade talks about this. I know I talk about it all the time. It's just such a beautiful way of talking about myth and story. He connects the word story with storehouse, and he's in the way that story is a storehouse for information that has been forgotten over time and is being held because it holds the necessary information to solve the problems of the present with lost knowledge from the past. So the more that we can connect with myth and story, the more clearly we actually begin to see patterns of the present and how to resolve them, which is a really beautiful thing to be able to have on hand for us. And this really extends to a lot of different aspects of our lives. But as it relates to perfectionism, it really also gives us a lot of permission to be imperfect, Because myth, I mean, we're often dealing with these larger than life characters, and we get to see how flawed they were, as well as the brilliance that they embody. Hercules or Heracles is a great example of this. You know, Hercules is seen as this, as the epitome of a hero. He completes all these labors. But we also see in the stories of him completing these labors that some of what got him into those labors in the first place was a hot temper. We see the way that he had labors added on because of the hot temper. We see ways that events were shifted not in his favor because of, you know, a singular mindset, a singular focus, and how he had to adapt as a human, as he had to adapt as a hero. The Hydra is a great example of this experience of Hercules being a little bit of a myopic character in some ways, having to challenge his perception of reality to overcome a challenge that was set in front of him. His MO of, if I hit it hard enough, often enough, it will be done. It'll resolve whatever problem is in front of me. When he's faced with the Hydra, that solution no longer solves the problem. And so we can see this evolution and we see this imperfection within this character. And it allows us to then take a step back and see within ourselves that, yes, we have rough edges. We have unintegrated material within us. We have unintegrated experiences and feelings, unintegrated parts. We have unhealed places within us. And that's actually important. That is actually part of the human experience, is that we have these wounds, that we have these burdens, we have these growth edges. Because honestly, if we didn't, life would be so dull, right? How could we actually expect everyone to be flawless and fully developed and whole and complete in the world that we're in? Does it really make sense? Because it really doesn't to me. I mean, what would it be like if everybody was? Well, it would be really different. In fact, it'd be so different, it's impossible to conceive of, because it's actually impossible. In fact, I want to say there are books that were written about it. I want to say it's Animal Farm. Maybe it's not Animal Farm. Maybe it's a different one of those dystopian novels of the time that a lot of kids have to read in high school, but where there is this way of everybody being so even-keeled all the time that it's so dull that then people start using drugs as a way to deviate from the status quo. I could be getting it wrong. That's what I remember of it, and I'm fine if I'm getting it wrong. Please correct me if you know what I'm talking about. But my point here is really that when we are connected to story, particularly myth, it gives us so much more permission to be our intrinsically flawed, beautiful human selves. Another thing that comes to mind that I think is really helpful is that as a way to reframe this from apology to actually empowerment, when we look at our flaws, when we look at our growth edges, there is this proverb, I want to say it's a biblical proverb, that says iron sharpens iron. When we look at that, by allowing ourselves permission to be imperfect, it actually allows other people to help see them, it allows other people to see themselves more clearly as well, also with a deeper capacity for compassion and growth and healing and integration, in part because sometimes our humanity bumps into other people's humanity and we have really difficult, tense, sometimes explosive conflict. But sometimes also, as we are able to work within ourselves more, we're able to simply speak to what is happening rather than speak from what is happening. We can be able to say, like, hey, listen, this experience with you is bringing something up inside of me. And I'm actually, as I sit with it, I'm noticing it's not about you at all, but it is about something within me. And I didn't even realize that was happening. And I'm really grateful that you are helping me to be able to see that about myself. And then the other person can have something similar happen. I think it's important that we take a step back and we realize that we do not have to apologize for not being perfect. The idea that we do is horrendously harmful, rooted in shame, and nobody needs to carry that 20-ton shield around with them anymore. And I'd encourage you to take some time and really work on developing that capacity for kindness and compassion for yourself. Realize that you can celebrate the wins, find your growth edges, explore the trailheads, work with what's coming up inside, and develop that capacity for compassion for yourself and for other people. And a huge tool that's going to help you along the way is the connection to myth and story. It'll show you that you have full permission from thousands of years of people across time, across locations, to be fully present as your imperfect, beautiful self. And as you do that, I would love to hear the stories that you're resonating with. I'd love to be able to hear and understand the kinds of things that are helping you feel like you can set aside this myth of perfection so that you can be able to really feel permission to be yourself. If you took anything away from this week's episode, I'd love to hear about it, leaving us a rating, a review, sharing a comment with us on what stood out to you. If you feel like there's someone that you know who could use a little reminder that they don't have to be perfect, consider sharing this episode with them. And if you have ideas for other topics that you'd like us to explore moving forward, I'd love to hear from you on that too. And so from me to you, as always, keep delving deep and embracing the journey.